For 15 years, Jonathan Hayes believed he had built a life with the love of his life, Rebecca. They had met in their early 20s, falling hard and fast for each other. Rebecca had always been a magnetic presence, smart, beautiful, and with a laugh that could fill a room. Together, they had built a home, raised 2 daughters, and woven their lives together with threads of shared memories and dreams for the future. But all of that came crashing down 4 years ago. It was a warm spring evening, and Jonathan was sitting on their back porch, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, when his screen lit up with an unexpected message. It was from a former colleague of his wife, someone he didn't know very well, but the name struck him as familiar. The message was brief, but its content was like a grenade thrown into his peaceful world. You deserve to know the truth about what happened after the corporate party 4 years ago. Ask Rebecca about the sauna. At first, Jonathan didn't understand. His mind scrambled to piece together the fragments of the message. The sauna? The corporate party? He remembered that night vaguely. It was Rebecca's company's annual retreat, an overnight event at a fancy lodge in the mountains. She had come home late the next evening, looking exhausted but happy, laughing about how much everyone had drunk and how chaotic things had gotten. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Why would he? He trusted her completely. But now his hands trembled as he reread the message. A pit began to form in his stomach, the kind of gut instinct that told him the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. That night, after the kids were asleep, he confronted Rebecca. He hadn't planned his words. They tumbled out of him in an avalanche of confusion and fear. What happened at the corporate retreat? 4 years ago? In the sauna, he asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay calm. Rebecca's reaction was immediate. Her face turned pale, her body stiffened, and her eyes darted away from his as if she were trying to hide something. Why are you asking about that?" she stammered. The room fell silent, the weight of her hesitation louder than any words she could have spoken. Jonathan felt his chest tighten as his worst fears began to take shape. "Because someone sent me a message," he said slowly. "And I think you need to tell me the truth." Rebecca sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. And then, in halting words, she confessed. She told him about the party, about how the drinks had flowed freely, how everyone had ended up in the sauna late that night, laughing and joking. And then, through tears, she admitted what Jonathan never imagined he would hear. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "It only happened once, John. I swear to you. I was drunk, and I didn't think. It meant nothing. But I know that doesn't make it any better." Jonathan stared at her, his heart pounding in his ears. His wife, the woman he had built his life around, had betrayed him. Not just with anyone, but with her colleagues, people she saw every day at work, people who likely knew the secret that had been hidden from him for 4 years. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was the lies, the deception, the thought that he had been living in blissful ignorance while she carried this secret. "I can't believe this," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. 4 years, Rebecca. 4 years you've let me live in the dark. How could you?" Rebecca wept, pleading with him to understand, to forgive her, to see that it was a drunken mistake that she deeply regretted. But Jonathan wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. In the days that followed Rebecca's confession, Jonathan felt like a stranger in his own life. Every time he looked at her, he saw the betrayal. He couldn't stop imagining that night, couldn't stop picturing the colleagues who had been there, their faces now tainted by what he knew. Rebecca, for her part, tried everything to make amends. She apologized constantly, gave him space when he needed it, and tried to reassure him that she would do anything to rebuild their trust. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It wasn't something that could be pieced back together with words and promises. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Rebecca broke the silence. "John, I know I can't take back what I did, but I need you to know that I love you. I've never stopped loving you, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Jonathan stared at her, his emotions warring within him. "I don't doubt that you love me," he said finally. "But love isn't the issue. It's trust. You broke it, Rebecca, and I don't know if we can get it back. Their conversations often ended like this, circling around the same wounds without finding a way to heal them. They both knew divorce wasn't an option. They had too much history, too many shared memories, and two daughters who still needed them to be a family. But staying together felt like a different kind of prison, one where the ghost of Rebecca's betrayal haunted every room of their home. 2 weeks after Rebecca's confession, Jonathan received another message from the same anonymous sender. "I'm sorry for what you're going through. You deserve better. If you want to know more, meet me at the coffee shop on Green Street tomorrow at 6 p.m. Jonathan debated whether to go. He didn't want to drag himself further into the darkness of that night, but a part of him, curious, angry, desperate for clarity, needed to know. So the next evening, he found himself at the coffee shop, scanning the room for the person who had sent the message. A man in his late 30s approached him hesitantly. He looked nervous, as if he were unsure about whether he should be there. "Jonathan?" the man asked. "I'm Simon." Jonathan recognized him immediately. He was one of Rebecca's former colleagues, one of the people who had been at that fateful party. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked, his tone sharp. "I don't want to cause trouble," Simon said quickly, "but I thought you should know the truth. Rebecca's not the only one who's sorry about what happened that night. It was chaotic, stupid, and none of us handled it the way we should have. I felt guilty about it ever since." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Why now? Why are you telling me this now, after all these years?" Simon looked down, ashamed. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of you living in ignorance. I've seen what guilt has done to Rebecca. She's been carrying this for years, John. And she really does love you." Jonathan wasn't sure whether Simon's words were meant to comfort him or twist the knife deeper. Either way, they left him with more questions than answers. As the months went on, Jonathan and Rebecca tried to find a new normal, but the strain of the betrayal weighed heavily on them. Every small disagreement seemed to spiral into an argument about trust, about honesty, about whether their marriage could survive. One evening, after putting their daughters to bed, Jonathan finally snapped. "I can't keep living like this," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "Every time I look at you, I see that night. I see what you did." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "John, I've done everything I can to show you how sorry I am. What more do you want from me?" "I want to forget," he said bitterly, "but I can't. And I don't know if I ever will." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, they both realized that their marriage might not survive this. Love, it seemed, wasn't always enough. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan and Rebecca made the difficult decision to seek counseling. They both knew that if their marriage had any chance of surviving, they needed help. Through therapy, they began to unpack the pain, the anger, and the resentment that had built up between them. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Jonathan wanted to walk away, when the weight of the betrayal felt too heavy to bear. But there were also moments of hope, moments when he saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman who was still fighting to save their marriage. Slowly, they began to rebuild. It wasn't a perfect process, and it wasn't without setbacks. But for the first time, Jonathan felt like they were truly confronting the wounds that had festered for so long. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were both willing to fight for their family. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Only time would tell if they could fully heal, but for now, they were taking it one day at a time, together. Despite their efforts in counseling, Jonathan couldn't escape the memories that haunted him. Therapy gave them tools to communicate better, and Rebecca had thrown herself into the process, doing everything the therapist suggested. Being transparent about her actions, answering his questions honestly, and rebuilding their emotional intimacy step by step. But Jonathan's mind kept circling back to the same image, Rebecca in the sauna with her colleagues. It was like a stain he couldn't wash out of his memory. One night, as they lay in bed, Jonathan broke the silence. "Do you ever think about it? About that night?" Rebecca turned her head toward him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and guilt. "Every day," she admitted. "Not because I miss it, but because it hurts me to know how much I've hurt you. If I could go back and erase it, I would." "Why did you do it?" Jonathan's voice cracked. This was a question he had asked many times, but her answer never seemed to satisfy him. He needed to hear something new, something that made sense of the senseless. Rebecca hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to explain it," she said softly. "I was drunk, yes, but it wasn't just the alcohol. I was feeling invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Not to you, not to myself. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. Invisible. The word stung, and he wondered if he had unknowingly contributed to her feelings of neglect. Had he been too focused on work? Too distracted by the routine of their lives? The thought both angered and saddened him. "I don't know if I can ever let it go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca reached for his hand. "You don't have to let it go all at once. But I'm not going anywhere, John. I'll keep fighting for us, even if it takes the rest of my life." Jonathan didn't respond, but he didn't pull his hand away either. It was a small gesture, but in their fractured world, it felt like progress. Months later, Jonathan received an unexpected call from one of Rebecca's former colleagues, a woman named Angela, who had also been at the infamous corporate retreat. Jonathan had seen her in passing at company events but had never spoken to her directly. "Jonathan," Angela began, her tone cautious, "I don't mean to stir things up, but I thought you should know something. Simon has been talking about that night again." Jonathan's grip tightened on his phone. "What's he saying?" Angela sighed. "He's been embellishing the story, making it sound worse than it was. I thought you should hear it from me before it gets back to you in some twisted form." Jonathan's blood boiled. Simon was the same man who had claimed to feel guilty about what happened. Now he was gossiping about it? The betrayal felt fresh all over again. That evening he told Rebecca about the call. Her face fell, and he could see the shame flood back into her expression. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought this was behind us." "It's not," Jonathan said, his anger barely contained. "And it won't be as long as people like Simon keep dragging it back into the light." For the first time, Jonathan saw Rebecca's guilt turn into anger. Not at him, but at Simon. "I'll handle it," she said firmly. "This isn't fair to you, and it's not fair to us. I won't let him use my mistake to hurt you again." The next day, Rebecca confronted Simon at his office. Jonathan didn't know exactly what she said to him, but the rumors stopped, and Simon sent Jonathan a brief, apologetic text. "I'm sorry for overstepping. It won't happen again." Jonathan was surprised by Rebecca's fierce defense of their relationship. It was the first time he had seen her fight for him, for them in a way that felt tangible. It didn't erase the past, but it gave him a flicker of hope that they might be able to move forward. One evening, after tucking their daughters into bed, Rebecca handed Jonathan an envelope. Her hands were shaking as she passed it to him. "What's this?" he asked, looking down at the neatly folded piece of paper. "It's a letter," Rebecca said. "For you. I've been writing it for weeks. I thought it might be easier for me to say everything I feel this way." Jonathan hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly smudged from where her tears had fallen. "Dear John, I don't know if words can ever truly capture how sorry I am for what I did to you, to us, to our family. There hasn't been a single day in the last 4 years when I haven't regretted my actions. I know I broke your trust, and I know that rebuilding it feels impossible right now. But I want you to know that I'm not giving up. You didn't deserve what I did. You have always been a good man, a loving husband, and an incredible father. My actions were not a reflection of you. They were a reflection of my own weaknesses. I let myself get swept up in a moment of stupidity, and I will carry that shame with me for the rest of my life. But despite everything, I still believe in us. I believe we can find a way back to each other, not as the people we were before, but as something stronger. I love you, John. I always have and I always will. Yours, Rebecca." Jonathan read the letter twice, his emotions swirling. He could feel the sincerity in her words, the rawness of her regret. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that forgiveness might not be a weakness, but a strength. Over the next year, Jonathan and Rebecca began to rebuild their relationship, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the memories of her betrayal would surface, threatening to undo their progress. But they had learned how to communicate in a way they never had before. They began carving out time for just the two of them. Date nights, weekend trips, even small gestures like cooking dinner together after the kids went to bed. It felt strange at first, like trying to learn a new language, but slowly, it became more natural. One evening, as they walked hand in hand along the beach, Jonathan turned to Rebecca. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" he asked. Rebecca smiled softly. "I don't think we'll ever go back to who we were. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can build something better." Jonathan nodded, the weight on his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, he began to believe her. 2 years after Rebecca's confession, Jonathan found himself standing in their backyard, watching their daughters play on the swing set. Rebecca was beside him, her laughter ringing out as she cheered the girls on. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy, something Jonathan hadn't thought possible after everything they had been through. That night, as they sat on the porch, Jonathan turned to Rebecca. "I forgive you," he said, his voice steady. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You don't know how much that means to me." "It doesn't mean I've forgotten," he added. "But I'm tired of carrying the weight of it. I want to move forward. With you." Rebecca reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice." In the months that followed, their marriage grew stronger than it had ever been. They weren't the same people they had been before the betrayal, but they had found a way to create a new version of their life together. One built on honesty, resilience, and love. The road ahead wasn't perfect, but Jonathan no longer felt like a prisoner to the past. He had chosen forgiveness, and in doing so, he had found freedom, not just for Rebecca, but for himself.